The galaxy had forgotten Earth 300 years ago, and the 12 species of the galactic conquered preferred it that way. Ambassador Kethari Solen stood at the observation window of her diplomatic cruiser, watching the dead planet spin slowly in the darkness below. Her scales, green and gold in the ship's artificial light, rippled with something that might have been discomfort or perhaps satisfaction. She could never quite tell which emotion humans stirred in her anymore. Earth looked peaceful from orbit, almost beautiful in a terrible way. The oceans had returned after the fires cooled, and clouds drifted across continents that no longer held cities or roads or any sign that a species called humanity had ever walked upon them. The Vethkai had been thorough in their work, burning everything until nothing remained but ash and silence. "Ambassador, the other delegations have arrived," her assistant announced from behind her, a young reptilian named Thresh who had never known a galaxy with humans in it. "The memorial ceremony will begin within the hour." Solen turned away from the window and straightened her diplomatic robes. Today was supposed to be a day of reflection, a day when the conquered acknowledged its greatest shame, though she suspected most of the delegates viewed it as little more than a political performance, a chance to appear compassionate without actually doing anything meaningful. The memorial beacon had been her idea, proposed 50 years ago when she was still a junior diplomat with foolish dreams of justice. She had argued that humanity deserved to be remembered, that their extinction should weigh upon the conscience of every species that had stood by and watched. The conquered had agreed, eventually, though they had taken their time, 50 years to approve a simple beacon, while the Vethkai Dominion continued to prosper and expand without consequence. She walked through the corridors of her ship toward the shuttle bay, passing crew members who bowed respectfully as she moved. They were all so young, she realized, born long after the war, taught about humans only through historical records and cautionary tales. To them, humanity was just another failed species, interesting perhaps but ultimately irrelevant to the present. The shuttle carried her down to the memorial station, a massive structure that floated in stable orbit above what had once been called North America. Delegates from all 12 conquered species had gathered in the central chamber, their various forms creating a strange tapestry of scales and fur and chitin and flesh. Solen recognized most of them, politicians and diplomats who had built careers on saying the right things while doing nothing at all. High Chancellor Vithmir of the Thessani Federation greeted her with a formal bow, his 4 arms folded in the gesture of respect. "Ambassador Solen, your dedication to this project has been admirable," he said, though his tone suggested he found the entire ceremony somewhat tiresome. 300 years is a long time to remember the dead. "Not long enough to forget how they died," Solen replied, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps guilt, perhaps merely annoyance at being reminded of uncomfortable truths. The Vethkai delegation stood apart from the others, their insectoid forms rigid and unreadable. They had protested the memorial for decades, arguing that it served no purpose except to stir up old grievances, but the conquered had overruled them. A small victory, Solen thought, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. The ceremony began with speeches, each delegate taking their turn to express sorrow and regret in carefully measured words. They spoke of humanity's potential, their remarkable adaptability, their fierce determination to survive on a world that seemed designed to kill them. They called Earth a death world, and marveled that any intelligent species had evolved there at all, surrounded by predators and disasters and diseases that would have wiped out lesser beings. Solen listened and said nothing, knowing that most of these words were hollow. The conquered had watched humanity reach for the stars, had observed their first tentative steps beyond their solar system, and had done nothing when the Vethkai decided that humans were too dangerous to live. Preemptive defense, the Dominion had called it, claiming that humanity's rapid advancement threatened galactic stability. The conquered had debated and deliberated and ultimately chosen neutrality, which was just another word for cowardice. When her turn came, Solène stepped forward to the podium and looked out at the assembled delegates. "We are here to remember a species that we failed," she began, her voice steady despite the anger that burned beneath her scales. "We speak of tragedy as though it were inevitable, but it was not. We made choices, all of us, and those choices led to extinction. Humanity did not simply die. They were murdered, and we allowed it to happen." The chamber fell silent, and she could feel the disapproval radiating from the other delegates. Such blunt words were not appropriate for diplomatic occasions, but Solène no longer cared about propriety. She had spent 3 centuries watching the galaxy pretend that humanity's death was simply an unfortunate event rather than a crime. "Let this beacon stand as a reminder," she continued, "not of what humanity was, but of what we are, a concord that speaks of justice while practicing none, an alliance of species that values stability over morality. We could have intervened. We chose not to. That is the truth we must carry." She stepped back from the podium, and after a moment of uncomfortable silence, the ceremony continued. The beacon was activated, sending its signal out into the void. A simple message in every known language, stating that humans had existed and that they were gone. As the delegates prepared to depart, a junior officer approached Solène with a confused expression. "Ambassador, we are detecting an anomaly in the outer system," the officer reported, consulting a data tablet. "Our long-range sensors have picked up an energy signature near the 6th planet's moons." "What kind of signature?" Solène asked, though she assumed it was merely a malfunction or perhaps a piece of debris from the old human colonies. "Unknown, Ambassador. The readings are inconsistent with any recorded technology, but they appear to be coming from beneath the ice of the moon designated Europa. The signature is faint but definitely artificial." Solène felt something cold move through her chest. Europa had been surveyed after the war, along with every other body in the system. The Vethkai had been thorough, ensuring that no human settlements had escaped their bombardment. Nothing should be alive in this system, nothing at all. "It must be a sensor error," she said, though she did not quite believe her own words. "Run a diagnostic and report your findings." The officer bowed and hurried away, and Solène turned back to the observation window. Below her, Earth continued its slow rotation, dead and silent, a tomb for billions. She had spent her entire career mourning a species she had never met, fighting for a memorial that could never bring them back. And yet, as she stared out at the darkness between worlds, she could not shake the feeling that something was watching her in return, something that had waited 300 years for this moment, something that remembered what the galaxy had done. She told herself it was impossible, that the dead did not return, that humanity was truly and finally gone. But the universe, she would soon learn, had never cared much for what was supposed to be possible. 40,000 souls lived beneath the ice of Europa, and every single one of them had been raised on stories of fire. Captain Myra Okonkwo walked through the corridors of the underground colony, her boots echoing against metal floors that had been laid by her great-great-grandparents. The tunnels stretched for miles beneath Europa's frozen surface, carved from rock and ice by desperate hands in the final days before Earth burned. This was humanity's tomb, but it was also humanity's cradle, a place where children were born knowing that the galaxy had tried to kill them and failed. She was 53 years old, with dark skin weathered by recycled air and eyes that had never seen a sunrise. No human alive had ever stood beneath an open sky or felt natural wind upon their face. They knew these things only from recordings, from the archives that the founders had saved before fleeing Earth's destruction. Myra had watched those recordings 1,000 times as a child, weeping for a world she would never touch. The Colony Council had summoned her to the central chamber, and she already knew why. The sensors had detected the conquered ships arriving in the system, had intercepted the broadcast announcing the memorial ceremony. After 300 years of hiding, the galaxy had finally returned to gloat over humanity's grave. "They are activating some kind of beacon," Counselor Chen reported as Myra entered the chamber. He was an old man, one of the few who still remembered the generation that had survived the Exodus. The signal is broadcasting in multiple languages, including ours. They are declaring humanity officially extinct. Myra stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the 12 council members who governed the colony. They were engineers and doctors and teachers, ordinary people who had inherited an extraordinary burden. None of them had chosen this life, but all of them had accepted it. "What are our options?" asked Counselor Adami, a young woman who represented the military faction. "We have the Prometheus ready for launch. This may be our only chance to strike while their ships are gathered." "Strike and accomplish what?" Counselor Yamamura countered, shaking his head. "We have one warship against an entire galactic alliance. Revenge might feel satisfying, but it would only confirm that we deserve to be extinct." The debate erupted around her, voices rising in anger and fear and frustration. Some demanded vengeance for Earth, for the billions who had burned while the galaxy watched. Others urged continued hiding, arguing that survival was more important than pride. They had survived 3 centuries through patience and discipline. Why risk everything now? Myra listened and said nothing, letting the arguments wash over her like waves against stone. She had heard these same debates her entire life, the endless tension between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to hide. Her father had believed in hiding, had died still believing that someday the galaxy would forget about humans and they could emerge in peace. Her mother had believed in fighting, had spent her final years training soldiers for a war that never came. But Myra believed in something else entirely. She believed in making a choice and accepting its consequences, whatever they might be. "Enough," she said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade. The council fell silent, turning to face her. "We have hidden for 300 years, and what has it gained us? We survive, yes, but we do not live. We exist in tunnels, breathing recycled air, teaching our children about a sun they will never see. Is this what our ancestors sacrificed everything to protect?" "What would you have us do?" Counselor Chen asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We cannot defeat the conquered, and the Vethkai would love nothing more than to finish what they started." "I would have us stop being ghosts," Myra replied. "They came here to mourn us, to pat themselves on the back for remembering the species they let die. I say we show them that we never died at all. Not to fight, not yet, but to remind them that humanity endures." The chamber erupted again, but this time the voices carried something new, something that sounded almost like hope. For generations, they had lived in secret, always afraid, always hiding. The thought of finally standing in the light, of showing the galaxy that humans still existed, was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The vote was close, but in the end the council agreed. The Prometheus would launch, not to attack but to announce, to tell the universe that humanity refused to be forgotten. Myra returned to her ship within the hour, moving through crowds of colonists who had gathered to watch. They reached out to touch her as she passed, pressing their hands against her uniform as though she were something sacred. She was not a hero, not yet, but she carried their hopes with her into the darkness. The Prometheus waited in her underground dock, a massive vessel of black metal and sharp angles. She had been built in secret during the final years before the war, designed to fight against enemies that humanity had never imagined. For 3 centuries, engineers had maintained and upgraded her systems, integrating salvaged alien technology with human innovation. She was old, but she was also something new, a weapon forged by patience and rage. "All stations report ready, Captain," her first officer announced as she took her seat on the bridge. Lieutenant Commander James Ockhaffer was a serious man with steady hands and eyes that had never known fear. He had been born to serve on this ship, raised from childhood to prepare for this moment. "The icebreakers are standing by." Myra looked around at her crew, at the men and women who had trained their entire lives for a mission that might end in death. They were soldiers, but they were also the children and grandchildren of survivors, people who carried 300 years of grief and anger in their bones. "Begin the ascent," she commanded. The Prometheus shuddered as her engines ignited, and the colony's icebreakers began carving a path through the frozen ceiling above. The ship rose slowly at first, pushing through layers of ice that had protected them for generations. Myra watched the displays as depth markers counted down, as they drew closer and closer to the surface. And then, with a roar of fire and steam, they broke through. The Prometheus emerged from Europa's ice like a creature rising from myth, her hull gleaming in the distant light of the sun. Water and ice vaporized around her, creating a column of steam that rose miles into the black sky. She was beautiful and terrible, a monument to everything humanity had suffered and everything they had become. On the memorial station, Myra knew, the conquered delegates would be watching in horror. Their sensors would be screaming alerts, their crews scrambling to understand what they were seeing. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before opening a channel to broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Captain Myra Okonkwo of the ISV Prometheus, speaking on behalf of the human survivors of Europa," she said, her voice steady and clear. 300 years ago, you declared our species extinct. You were wrong." She paused, letting the words echo across the void, reaching every ship and station in the system. "Humanity remembers what was done to us. Humanity remembers who stood by and watched, but we have not come for vengeance. Not today. We have come to tell you that we endure, that we survived your silence and your complicity, and that we are watching." The Prometheus hung in space above Europa, her weapons powered but not aimed, her message delivered. Across the system, the conquered ships were moving, their crews panicking, their commanders demanding answers that no one could provide. Myra sat back in her chair and waited. The galaxy had forgot humanity, but now they would remember, and remembering, she knew, was only the beginning. "Let them look upon us," she said quietly to her crew. "Let them see what their fear created." And in that moment, as the Prometheus stood defiant against the stars, humanity was no longer extinct. They were awake, and the universe would never be the same. The galaxy had not known true panic in centuries, but humanity's return changed that in a single broadcast. Ambassador Kethari Solen sat in the emergency session of the Galactic Concord, watching delegates from 12 species shout at each other across the great circular chamber. Order had collapsed within hours of the Prometheus emerging from Europa, replaced by accusations and demands and barely concealed terror. For 300 years, they had believed humans extinct, and now that comfortable lie had shattered into 1,000,000 dangerous pieces. "This is clearly a deception," the Vethkai ambassador declared, his mandibles clicking with agitation. "Our forces were thorough. No humans could have survived the cleansing of Earth. This must be some alien species using human technology to deceive us." "The genetic scans confirm they are human," Solen replied, forcing her voice to remain calm. "The Prometheus crew transmitted biological data along with their message. There is no deception. Humanity survived, and they have been watching us for 300 years. The chamber erupted again, and Solen closed her eyes against the noise. She had dreamed of this moment for decades, had imagined what it would mean to learn that humanity had endured the genocide. But now that the dream was real, she found herself frightened by its implications. High Chancellor Vithmir finally restored order, his voice booming through the chamber's amplification systems. "We must address this situation with clarity and purpose," he announced. "The question before us is simple. What do we do about the humans?" "We finish what we started," the Vethkai ambassador hissed. "They are a threat to galactic stability, just as they were 3 centuries ago. We cannot allow them to rebuild and spread. Another cleansing is necessary." "Another genocide, you mean?" Solen said coldly. "Have you learned nothing from the past? Humanity survived your first attempt to destroy them. What makes you think a second attempt would succeed?" "Because this time we know where they are hiding," the ambassador replied. "Europa can be cracked open like an egg. We have weapons capable of shattering moons. Give us permission, and we will end this threat permanently." Solène felt rage building in her chest, scales flushing dark with emotion. She wanted to scream at the ambassador, to demand justice for crimes that had been committed before she was born. But she knew that anger would accomplish nothing here. Politics required patience, even when patience felt like cowardice. "The conquered does not authorize genocide," Vithmir said firmly, though Solène noticed he did not sound entirely convinced. "We will attempt diplomacy first. Ambassador Solène, you proposed the memorial that brought us to Sol. You will lead the negotiations with the human survivors." She had expected this assignment, had known it was coming the moment the Prometheus emerged from the ice. She was the only member of the Conquered who had ever advocated for humanity, the only one who might be trusted to speak with them. It was an honor and a burden, and she accepted both without hesitation. The journey to Europa took 3 days, and Solène spent every hour preparing for a conversation she had imagined her entire career. What did you say to a species that had watched you do nothing while their world burned? What words could possibly bridge 3 centuries of grief and rage? Captain Myra Okonkwo met her in a small conference room aboard the Prometheus, a sparse chamber with metal walls and harsh lighting. The human captain was smaller than Solène had expected, but her eyes held a weight that made her seem ancient, the weight of a species that had learned to survive through sheer stubbornness. "Ambassador," Myra said, her voice neutral, "I appreciate your willingness to meet, though I suspect you are not here by choice." "I am here because I want to be," Solène replied. "I have spent my life trying to make the conquered acknowledge what was done to your people. Now that you have returned, I want to help you find a path forward." Myra studied her for a long moment, and Solène felt as though she were being weighed and measured by those dark eyes. "A path forward," the captain repeated. "Do you know what forward looks like to us? We want 3 things: recognition of human sovereignty, reparations for the destruction of Earth, and the Vethkai commanders who ordered the attack delivered to face trial for their crimes." Solène felt her heart sink. These were not unreasonable demands, but she knew the conquered would never accept them. Recognition might be possible, even reparations of some kind, but handing over Vethkai military leaders for trial would be seen as an act of war by the Dominion. "I will present your terms to the conquered," she said carefully. "But I must be honest with you. The 3rd demand will be difficult, perhaps impossible. The Vethkai will never surrender their own people for judgment." "Then there can be no true peace," Myra replied. "Only a pause between conflicts. We have waited 300 years. We can wait longer if necessary, but we will never forget and we will never forgive without justice." The negotiations continued for weeks, but progress was slow. The conquered debated endlessly, with some species supporting humanity's demands and others siding with the Vethkai. The Dominion grew increasingly aggressive, threatening war if their commanders were put on trial. Tension spread across the galaxy like poison in a wound. And then everything changed. The distress signal arrived on a quiet morning, cutting through all diplomatic channels with emergency priority. It came from Thesson IV, the agricultural hub of the Thessani Federation, a peaceful world that had never known conflict. The message was simple and terrifying. "We are under attack, unknown forces, ships like nothing we have seen. Please send help, millions will die." Solène watched the recordings in horror as massive vessels emerged from the darkness between stars, their hulls black and organic, their weapons firing beams of energy that cut through Thessani defense ships like paper. The Krethver had arrived, nomadic predators from beyond the charted regions of space, a species that existed only to consume and destroy. The conquered fleet was weeks away, scattered across the galaxy on various missions. The Vethkai Dominion refused to help, claiming that Thesson IV was not their concern. High Chancellor Vithmir pleaded for assistance, but no one was close enough to respond in time. No one except the Prometheus, which was only 3 days from Thesson IV at maximum speed. Solène found herself standing before Myra once again, this time not as a diplomat but as a beggar. "I know we have no right to ask," she said, her voice breaking. "I know what the Conquered did to your people, what we allowed to happen. But there are children on that world, families who have done nothing wrong. Please, you are the only ones who can reach them in time." Myra's expression was unreadable, and Solène felt despair settling into her bones. Why would humanity help the galaxy that had abandoned them? Why would they spend human lives defending aliens who had watched Earth burn without lifting a finger to help? "I need to consult with my crew," Myra said finally. "This is not my decision to make alone." She turned and walked away, and Solène was left standing in the corridor, surrounded by humans who looked at her with eyes full of old wounds. She had never felt more alone, more aware of the gulf between species, more certain that the universe was a cold and merciless place. All she could do was wait and hope that humanity was better than the galaxy deserved. The crew of the Prometheus gathered in the ship's main hall, and Captain Myra Okonkwo looked out at the faces of people who had never known a home beyond metal walls. They were soldiers and engineers, doctors and pilots, men and women who had trained their entire lives for war against the species that had murdered their ancestors. Now they were being asked to risk everything to save those very species, and Myra could see the conflict burning in their eyes. "You all heard the distress call," she said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. "Thesson IV is under attack. Millions will die if no one intervenes. We are the only ship close enough to help." Lieutenant Commander Ockhafer stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Captain, with respect, why should we care? The Thessani were members of the Conquered when Earth burned. They voted to do nothing while our world died. Let them face the consequences of their neutrality." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Myra felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. They were right to be angry. The galaxy had abandoned humanity, had watched from a safe distance while the Vethkai turned Earth into a graveyard. What did humanity owe to species that had considered them expendable? "I understand your anger," she said. "I feel it too. Every day I wake up knowing that my ancestors died because the galaxy was afraid of us, because they thought we were too dangerous to live. That rage is part of who we are now. It lives in our bones." She paused, looking out at her crew, at the descendants of survivors who had clawed their way through 300 years of darkness. "But I also remember what my grandmother taught me before she died. She told me about Earth, about the world we lost, not just the cities and the forests and the oceans, but the ideas we carried. She said humans were always at their best when they helped others, when they stood up for those who could not stand for themselves. She said that was what made us human." "That Earth is gone," someone called from the crowd. "We are not those people anymore." "No, we are not," Myra agreed. "We are harder now, colder, shaped by suffering that our ancestors never imagined. But the question is, do we want to stay this way forever? Do we want to become the thing they feared we might become, a species that cares only for its own survival?" She thought of the recordings she had watched as a child, images of a blue world spinning in sunlight, of humans reaching out to help strangers even when it cost them everything. That world was ash now, but the memories remained, and memories, she knew, could be seeds for something new. "On Thesson IV, there are children who have done nothing wrong," she continued. "They never voted to abandon us. They never chose the sins of their ancestors. They are just children, afraid and dying, and we have the power to save them." The hall fell silent, and Myra could feel the mood shifting. Not everyone agreed with her, but enough of them were listening. Enough of them remembered the stories of who humans used to be. "I am not ordering anyone to fight," she said. This is a choice, the most important choice we have ever made. We can let Thesson IV burn and no one would blame us. We would be justified and the galaxy would understand. Or we can be something better than justified. We can show the universe that humanity is not what they feared. She waited, watching faces, reading the struggle in their eyes. Lieutenant Commander Ockhaffer was the first to speak. "Captain, I still think the conquered deserves to burn," he said slowly. "But you are right about the children. I did not survive Europa just to become the kind of monster who lets innocents die. I am with you." One by one, others stepped forward. Weapons officers and medics, engineers and pilots, each of them making the same choice. Not everyone agreed, and Myra knew some would never forgive her for this decision. But enough of them believed, enough of them remembered, and that would have to be enough. The Prometheus jumped to Thesson IV at maximum speed, her engines straining against the fabric of space itself. 3 days compressed into an eternity of waiting, of preparation, of staring at tactical displays that showed the Krethver armada growing larger with every hour. They arrived to find hell. 50 Krethver warships surrounded the planet, their black hulls absorbing light like wounds in space. The Thessani defense fleet had been reduced to debris, scattered across orbit like broken toys. On the surface below, cities burned as landing parties spread across the continents. "All hands to battle stations," Myra commanded, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Launch all fighters, charge primary weapons, show them what an Earthborn warship can do." The Prometheus dove into the chaos like a blade of fire, her railguns screaming death across the void. The first Krethver ship never saw her coming. One moment it was firing upon escape shuttles. The next it was splitting apart as hypervelocity rounds punched through its hull. The enemy fleet turned toward this new threat, their commanders confused by sensors that showed only one ship. Surely no single vessel would be foolish enough to challenge them alone. They were wrong. 3 centuries of engineering had transformed the Prometheus into something the galaxy had never imagined. Her weapons combined human innovation with salvaged alien technology. Her shields flickered between frequencies faster than enemy targeting systems could track. Her crew fought with the precision of people who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Myra watched the battle unfold around her, issuing orders with a calm she did not feel. 2 Krethver dreadnoughts fell within the first hour, their crews unable to comprehend how a single ship could move so fast, hit so hard, survive so much. The Prometheus danced through plasma fire, her engines screaming as she twisted between kill zones. "Hull breach on Deck 7, Ockhaffer reported, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, shields at 40% and falling. "Divert power from non-essential systems," Myra ordered. "Keep the guns firing. We stop when they stop." Hour after hour the battle raged, and the Prometheus paid for every victory in blood and metal. Compartments flooded with radiation, damage control teams died sealing breaches, medical bays overflowed with wounded who had given everything they had. But still she fought, still she held the line. On the planet below, evacuation shuttles began reaching orbit, carrying thousands of Thessani civilians to safety. They passed through gaps in the enemy fleet that existed only because the Prometheus drew fire away from them, sacrificing herself piece by piece to buy time for strangers. By the 6th hour, 12 Krethver ships had fallen, but the Prometheus was bleeding. Her port weapons array was gone, her engines laboring, her hull scarred with wounds that went down to the bone. Myra knew they could not survive much longer, but she also knew they could not stop. Not while civilians were still dying. "Captain, enemy flagship is moving to intercept," her tactical officer reported. "She is 3 times our mass with weapons we cannot match." Myra looked at the display, at the massive Krethver command ship bearing down upon them, and she made her decision. "All power to forward batteries," she said. "We are going straight through her." The Prometheus charged, her remaining engines burning at full power, her crew knowing that this might be their final moment. The flagship fired, and the world became fire and noise and pain. But the Prometheus kept coming, her railguns tearing into the enemy hull, her crew refusing to die. And when the smoke cleared, when the firing finally stopped, the HFY flagship was drifting dead in space, her command deck shattered, her fleet suddenly leaderless. The remaining enemy ships hesitated, then turned and ran. The battle was over. The Prometheus had won. Myra sat in her captain's chair, surrounded by the wounded and the dying, watching the HFY fleet disappear into the darkness. Her ship was crippled, barely holding together, but Thesson IV still stood. Millions of lives had been saved by people who had every reason to let them burn. "Casualty report," she said quietly. 217 dead, HFY replied, his voice cracking. 300 more wounded. We lost a lot of good people today, Captain. Myra closed her eyes and felt the weight of those numbers settle into her soul. They had won, but victory always came at a cost, and this cost, she knew, would haunt her for the rest of her days. But when she opened her eyes and looked at her surviving crew, she saw something that almost made the pain worthwhile. She saw pride, she saw purpose, she saw people who had proven that humanity was more than its grief. They had shown the galaxy who they truly were, not monsters, not victims, but something far more dangerous. They were heroes. The galaxy watched the battle recordings in silence, and for the first time in 300 years, they truly saw humanity. Ambassador Cathari Solin stood in the Galactic Concord chamber as the footage played on massive screens above the assembled delegates. They watched the Prometheus dive into the HFY fleet alone, watched her dance through fire and death, watched her crew sacrifice themselves to save a world that had never lifted a finger to help them. By the time the recording ended, even the Vethkai ambassador had nothing to say. They had every reason to let Thesson IV burn, High Chancellor Vithmir said softly, breaking the heavy silence. We abandoned their species to genocide. We ignored their pleas for justice. We debated their right to exist while they waited for our decision. And yet when the moment came, they chose to save our people at the cost of their own. Solin felt tears forming in her eyes, and she did not try to hide them. She had spent her entire career advocating for humanity, but even she had not truly believed they would do what they had done. She had hoped, yes, but hope and belief were different things. The question before this council is no longer what to do about humanity, she said, stepping forward to address the assembly. The question is what to do about ourselves. We called them dangerous. We called them a threat to galactic stability. We let them be slaughtered because we were afraid of what they might become. And what did they become? They became the only species willing to die for strangers. The chamber erupted in debate, but the tone was different now. Guilt and shame colored the arguments where fear had once dominated. Even the Vethkai ambassador seemed diminished, his earlier confidence replaced by something that might have been doubt. 3 days later, the Conquered voted unanimously to recognize human sovereignty. Reparations were promised, territories allocated, resources pledged to help rebuild what had been lost. It was not justice, not truly, but it was a beginning, a first step on a road that would take generations to walk. The matter of the Vethkai commanders was more complicated, but even here progress was made. The Dominion agreed to internal tribunals, to investigations that would eventually lead to acknowledgments of wrongdoing. It was not the public trial humanity had demanded, but it was more than anyone had expected from a species that had never admitted fault for anything. Solin traveled to the crippled Prometheus to deliver the news in person, finding Captain Myra Okonkwo in the ship's medical bay. The human captain was wounded, her arm in a regeneration cast, her face pale from blood loss, but her eyes were sharp as ever, watching Solin with the same measuring gaze she had shown from the beginning. The Conquered has accepted your terms, Solin said. Most of them, at least. There will be compromises and disappointments. Politics that drag on for years. but the fundamental recognition you asked for, humanity's right to exist, to grow, to take your place among the stars, that has been granted." Myra was silent for a long moment, and Solène wondered what thoughts were moving behind those dark eyes. Was she satisfied? Was she disappointed? After 300 years of waiting, did this moment feel like victory or merely exhaustion? 217 of my people died at Thesson IV, Myra said finally. They will never see this recognition. They will never know that their sacrifice meant something. I have to write letters to their families, explaining why their children and parents and siblings are not coming home. "I am sorry," Solène replied, and she meant it more than she had ever meant anything. "I cannot bring them back. I cannot undo what was done to your species. All I can offer is the promise that their deaths will not be forgotten, by us, by the Thessani, by every species that watched what your ship did." Myra nodded slowly, and something in her expression softened. Just a little, just enough for Solène to see the grief beneath the iron. "My grandmother used to say that humanity was meant for something more than survival," she said. "She believed we were supposed to reach out to the stars, to find other life and learn from it, to build something greater than any single species could build alone. She died still believing that, even after Earth burned." "Do you believe it?" Solène asked. "I did not," Myra admitted. "For most of my life, I believed we were meant only to endure, to outlast our enemies through stubbornness and spite. But watching my crew at Thesson IV, seeing them choose compassion over justified hatred, I think I am beginning to understand what she meant." She looked out the medical bay window at the stars beyond, at the infinite darkness that had seemed so cold for so long. "We are not what we were before the fire," she continued. "We can never go back to the innocence our ancestors had, but perhaps we can become something new, something shaped by suffering but not defined by it, something that remembers the pain but chooses to build rather than destroy." Solène felt hope stirring in her chest, a fragile thing that she had almost forgotten how to feel. "There is a long road ahead," she said. "Trust will take time to build. Old wounds will not heal quickly. There will be setbacks and failures and moments when it seems like nothing has changed." "I know," Myra replied, "but we have survived 300 years in the dark. We can be patient a little longer." The Prometheus limped back toward Europa, escorted now by conquered ships that had come to honor the vessel and her crew. Along the way, they passed through systems where other species had gathered to watch, their ships forming corridors of light as the wounded warship passed. It was a gesture of respect, the first of many that would come in the years ahead. On Europa, the colony emerged from beneath the ice for the first time in 3 centuries. 40,000 humans stepped onto the surface of a moon that had been their prison and their refuge, looking up at the stars with eyes that no longer had to hide. Children who had never known anything but tunnels and recycled air stood in wonder as they saw the universe spread out before them. Myra watched from the Prometheus as repair drones began the long work of healing her ship. She would need to be rebuilt almost entirely, but the engineers were confident she would fly again. And this time, she would not fly alone. Ambassador Solène found her standing at the observation window, looking down at the celebrations below. "What happens now?" the ambassador asked. "Now we rebuild," Myra said. "Not just ships and colonies, but connections, relationships with species who were our enemies and might become our allies. It will be hard, and there will be those on both sides who cannot let go of the past. But we have to try, because the alternative is becoming exactly what they feared we would become." "And Earth?" Solène asked quietly. "The conquered has agreed to return it to human sovereignty. Will you try to restore it?" Myra was silent for a long time, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion. "Earth can never be what it was. The forests and cities, the cultures and histories, they are gone forever. But perhaps it can become something else. Perhaps it can be a memorial and a promise, a reminder of what was lost and what we are determined to become." She turned to face Solène, And for the first time, the ambassador saw something like peace in the human captain's eyes. "My grandmother told me that extinction is not just death," Myra said. "It is forgetting who you were supposed to be. We spent 300 years remembering, keeping alive the stories and values of a world that no longer exists. Now we have the chance to take those memories and turn them into something real." She looked back at the stars, at the infinite possibilities waiting in the darkness. "We refuse to forget," she said, "and now finally we can begin to live." Below them, on the frozen surface of Europa, children were playing in spacesuits, throwing ice at each other and laughing in a way that no human had laughed for 300 years. They were the future now, inheritors of a legacy of grief and survival and stubborn hope. And above them the Prometheus waited, scarred but unbroken, a symbol of everything humanity had endured and everything they might yet become. The galaxy had declared them extinct, and they had answered with fire and sacrifice and an impossible act of grace. Humanity endured, and now at last humanity would rise.